And we're live on the Gio and Joey show. I'm in a giddy mood. My Boston Celtics are up 2-0 in the NBA Finals. We're going to bring it home, get one more championship than the Lakers. Joey, how you doing today?
Better than I deserve.
Okay, brother, let the audience know what we have in store for them today. I think it's going to be a great topic, but go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, it's kind of like what this whole thing, why we started this out. Our passion is for liberty, liberty of conscience, right? And politically, the way that that was best encapsulated in human history, in my view, is in America, right? Now, America has not always lived up to its best ideals, but those ideals have always been there. And right now, I think because of the times we're living in, there's people who are generally on the more conservative side, which my whole life, that's been the side that's championed America, that's championed the Constitution. But they're kind of there's a certain wing. I don't think it's a majority at this point, but who are starting to become disillusioned with the idea of America, right? Disillusioned with the Constitution and the Revolution. So I figured we got to talk about it, right? As defenders of the revolution.
No, that's good. Look, and the videos we're going to watch and the paper you send me are fascinating stuff. I wish everybody would at least read the paper. And if we get to it, we'll describe it. But look, the nation as I see it right now, from a biblical prophetic standpoint, is headed down exactly where prophecy said it would go. But the notion is, can we get others to see it, especially those who do not believe in the Bible like we do? And so, from a natural standpoint, from a political persuasive argument, can we get them to see that the nation is headed down a path it doesn't want to go to? And then there are individuals like this video we're going to watch who I think assess the problem, but their solutions may not be good. Would you characterize that as a good intro to the video?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good intro. And to your other point, what I had a conversation or had a little back and forth with Joel Berry from the Babylon Bee on X, and he had tweeted out, he's like, "I'm not ready to give up on America." And so I responded, I'm like, "Listen," and it's kind of Andrew Clavin's line. It was like, "Listen, from what I know from prophecy, at some point before Jesus comes, America is going to stop being America. But here's the thing. I don't know when that is. And so the last thing you're going to see as that ship sinks beneath the icy waters of totalitarianism, my fist holding onto the Constitution."
Yeah, and look, and look, you and I obviously maybe one day we'll do a Bible study on America in prophecy. But the truth is, I've always said to myself, this is the only nation I would die trying to defend. But that being said, I also know that this very nation that I would die to defend is one day going to betray its own principles. But that will be obviously when Jesus comes back again. You want to dive into the video now?
Let's go.
All right, brother. Let's do this like Brutus. I don't,
Today I want to talk about death. Sometimes it's expected, like when your fish dies while you're on vacation. Sometimes it's a total surprise, like when your fish jumps out of its bowl and shoots your dog. Either way, it teaches the kids an important lesson. But not everyone responds to death the same way. Some take it as an opportunity to honor the one who's passed. Some deal with it in what we might call less healthy ways. But what I really want to talk about is the death of the American constitutional order. And yes, it's as dead as Norman Bates' mom. And the people in charge of it are running around in its clothes murdering people. Also, spoilers for a movie that came out in 1960. Look out, by the end I might spoil a Sophocles play. Now, I realize this is a big claim, but to even understand it, we have to address three questions. 1, what is a constitution? 2, what was our constitution? And 3, what happened? First, what is a constitution? According to Joseph de Maistre, a constitution isn't in the first place a document. It's a nation's history, traditions, and social fabric. It's the unspoken things that constitute a nation. Before it's written, it's unwritten. Shout out Natasha Bedingfield. For de Maistre, societies can't be rationally designed from scratch. Instead, constitutions evolve organically over generations from a people's unique character and experiences. So you can't make a society with pen and paper. The same way you can't go up to a garbage dump and just put up a sign that says, "This is a farm now." Well, you could, but you get it. In his view, written constitutions are weaker than unwritten ones. There are some things you shouldn't have to write down because they're so fundamental. We tend to write things down when they're in trouble. Take the YouTube channel Pasta Grannies. The reason there's 500 videos of old Italian ladies making noodles is because they're some of the only people on the planet who still have these particular skills. These are the real female superheroes. Eat your heart out, Feige. In a healthier time, these things were passed down organically. We're only writing down these recipes when we're afraid we might forget them. But back to the political. A healthy society doesn't need a law against transing kids. It's just assumed. Just like a healthy business doesn't need a rule against cooking meth in the bathrooms. Even biblical law wasn't given to Israel because they were doing so well. But as decline sets in, more and more gets codified in an attempt to stop it. You get lawmakers chasing societal decay with a legislative pooper scooper. In short, the American Constitution was created.
All right, so what jumped out at you? What do you want to pick and poke?
Well, so here's the thing. He's right that the Constitution is only as good as the people's willingness to live by it and be ruled by it, and then the rulers, willingness to go along with it. That's true, because other than that, if everybody just ignores it, it's just words on paper. And also, he's right, and this is a one thing that I give him a lot of credit for, is it's important that it be inculcated, right? In other words, that there's something about culture that makes the Constitution work. There's the famous sociologist Max Weber, right? He's the guy who kind of coined the term Protestant work ethic, right? Many of these things. Well, he was talking about the fact he was a professor, right? So he teach sociology, and he was teaching, and he had these German students and some American students. And he said, the German students, in a lot of ways, were better in every way as students, right? They were, show up on time, all these different things. But he's like, but the American students were more free. And so the point was like the American students, they were much more likely to push back in class, to ask questions, to argue about, the grade that they got, whatever. They were much more likely to assert themselves, to not just go along because the professor said so. And a point that he made is like, there's something in the American conscience that is freer because we've lived in a culture that has had this freedom that's been shaped by really Protestant Christianity, right? Judaism to an extent as well. And so that all's true. And so when you see people shifting the culture and you see the culture shifting, that is going to have an effect on the Constitution. But, and as he goes on, I don't think that the situation is as dark necessarily as he does. I certainly don't believe the Constitution is dead. I believe it's like in every generation. I mean, there are threats to it, but I think it's still there. And I think the fact that we live our lives the way we do, and it's the envy of most people in the world, is evidence of that, right? Like, yes, there's
So let me ask you a
problems,
question.
but
Let me jump in here and ask you a question. So if you don't believe the Constitution is dead, and neither do I, when would it be dead in your eyes?
I mean, it would be dead when the practical effects, right? In other words, right, when it can no longer be appealed to, right? When there's no process, right? When the government, right? When you literally have no appeal to, say, wrongful imprisonment, or when, say, somebody accuses you of a crime and you can't have mount a defense, right? You can't stand before a jury of your peers, right? You can't appeal that process. That's when I would say it would be dead. And I just think that the practical reality that we're living in today is not that. Now, again, there are threats, there are violations of the Constitution, but I think if anybody actually looks at their own life day to day, and really honestly assess it compared to the rest of the world, you would realize that the Constitution actually is still it. While it may not get all the bad stuff, it's like a filter, right? Some bad stuff may come through the filter, but the filter's still there. And if the filter was gone, you'd get the whole torrential downpour
I
of
think, look,
authoritarian.
for me, you alluded to this, in the day-to-day life of most people, especially in the neighborhood I live in Texas, and my neighborhood particularly can probably arm a militia. It's conservative. I mean, and so when I talk to my neighbors, just the day-to-day stuff about our kids and about, their aspirations and about the neighborhood and God and country and things like that, it seems like the Constitution is thriving. However, right, it's when we get into partisan politics, when we get on Twitter, really, and on YouTube and things like this, that obviously there are definitely threats. And I like the point he made that when we were more a people that had the same moral values, you didn't have to make laws about men changing in women's bathroom. Right? You didn't have to make laws that were, for all intents and purposes, should be obvious that those are things you don't do. And so, but I don't see that as the death of the Constitution. I see that as more a threat to the Constitution because he's going to quote one of our favorite quotes, right, with John Adams. And it's true. We are losing that type of individual here in the country, but that doesn't mean the Constitution is dead. Is basically means we need a revival, a personal revival.
Yeah, and what I would say that Mr. Stotts needs to read is that essay that we're going to talk about. In
We'll
other
get
words,
to it.
this is the practical question that I have for these conservatives that say, we got to move on from the Constitution, or we got to move on from this. It's like, here's the thing: revolutions have a track record, and that track record is not good, right? And
Hmm.
again, now that's as a patriot, some people would say, well, don't you like the American one? I'm like, yes, but the American Revolution is
Is
in
unique.
many ways historically an exception, right? The French Revolution and the heads that rolled, that's the norm for revolution. And so when people are saying like, oh, we just, rather than try to repair, which is what I think the role of a conservative should be, it's repair, restore, these things, rather than to say, well, it's dead, so we've just got to go to something else. Yeah, well, that something else is covering a lot of things. It's like, I don't know that I like your something else. I'll stick with
Yeah.
the
What's the old saying? The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. In this case, right? The natural question I have is, okay, the Constitution in your eyes is dead, and you want to replace it. My natural question is, with what? What do you have that's going to be better? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing that's going to be better. Is our Constitution perfect? No. But there's nothing you can propose that's going to be better that will allow the smaller people, right? The more conservative people, an equal voice against the, what's the word? The hedonism of big cities. And so there's nothing. Because anything that you may propose, and people like him may propose, if it's ruling with an iron fist or ruling with a heavy hand, well, no. Look, I may disagree with a lot of people, but on this show, obviously, I'm talking to the audience now, we protect liberty of conscience. Want to keep going with the video?
Yeah.
By and for a certain kind of people, and you can't separate the document from the people it was written for. John Adams said it was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And as Aaron McIntyre
Let's actually put that quote up there on the screen. Did I go too far? Yes. There we go. Okay, why do we tell the audience why we love this quote so much? Let me go back to it.
Well, because Wade's right on this point, and John Adams,
Hmm.
I mean, more specifically, John Adams is right, right? Yes, our Constitution requires people that are self-governing is another way to put it, right? In other words, if you're not going to be ruled top down, right? Because what's the old adage, right? America is a nation without a king and a church without a pope, right? In other words, it's based on the Protestant idea from Scripture, right, of the priesthood of all believers. But guess what? That means, well, on a church side, that means you have to study the Bible for yourself. That means you're accountable to God, right, as an individual, right? And so you know you're going to be responsible in all those ways to his law and to his things, right? But that's between you and him, not you and the church, not you and the bishop of Rome, not you and your pastor, right? You and God, right? We have an intercessor, and his name is Jesus Christ. It's not your local parish priest, right? You can go right to Christ, right, because of his sacrifice. And so that's on the church side, but then on the state side, it's means, yeah, you Washington was not meant in our system to rule your life. In my case, Lansing was not meant to rule my life. Austin was not meant to rule your life, right? Because at the end of the day, the assumption of the Constitution is that you're going to rule your life, right? That you're going to be a self-governed individual, right? That lives a life in accord with natural law. And obviously, human nature is fallen, right? So there's going to be problems. So we do have government and we do have these different things to sort out those. But at the core is it assumes that the majority of society is going to be self-governing. And when you lose that, well, then the chords start to break.
Yeah, look, and the notion that John Adams put here, right, that it's not only moral and religious people. You know, you can try to have a morality, but if it doesn't have its anchor in God, if it doesn't have its anchor in a higher power greater than you, then that morality eventually will find a way to dissipate, will find a way to be swayed either by the masses or by, political expediency. And so he made it a good point. Look, we need to be ethical, we need to have integrity, but we have to realize that those notions, the higher appeal to something better comes from religion, which is a notion that we were created in God's image and that we are to be free, especially free of conscience. And so just because, and this is where we agree with this Wade guy, that unfortunately we are losing that both in the political realm and in the religious realm. Uh, I lament the days that we are in now, but I remember the days when at least politically we could agree to disagree and be civil about it. But today, I mean, politics seems like it's the Jerry Springer show or, WWE or F or whatever they call it these days. And obviously, even within Christianity, I think I saw a headline today of a well-known social media type pastor who had to resign for some undisclosed moral sin. And when the leaders, both politically and religious, are being exhibited in this kind of manner, no wonder the Constitution is threatened. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with what you're saying, and I agree on the moral failings. But so there's an article by this guy Greg Nunziata at the Dispatch, and he used to he used to do stuff for he used to work for Marco Rubio, right? He's been around Washington, a ways. His conservative legal mind, and he wrote an article for the Dispatch said the conservative legal movement got everything it wanted, it could lose it all. And he's kind of
Mhm.
talking about this new movement to now abandon the Constitution, right? Abandon originalism, which since the Reagan
Mhm.
administration, really that's been the governing philosophy of the conservative legal movement. And their push has been to get judges elected or chosen to courts and appointed to courts who have this originalist view. and they've been successful. The Supreme Court has a 6-3 originalist majority. And
Mm.
and here's the thing. This is the other thing. And this is what and we're going to continue watching the video. But this is my biggest thing with him is like, no, let's actually work within the system, right? Like there's so many levers that are actually going in our way. Roe versus Wade was the law of the land, terribly decided, right? It made up a right to privacy, the penumbras of the emanations of the dried ink of the Constitution, and for 50 years it was this sham law of the land. It was just overturned what 2 years ago, right? Now, guess what? The argument gets to be had, and we're going to lose some state battles. We're going to lose some, but we got to keep convincing people, right? I was reading one report, and they were estimating how many babies have been born in excess because of the overturning of Roe, because of now pro-life laws have been allowed to go forward in various states, and it's in the millions. Well, that is the kind of thing, right? Again, as a pro-lifer, that's the kind of thing that should be sending like shock waves of ecstasy through the pro-life crowd. That's
Hmm.
like, yes, it's not perfect, right? Abortion still happens. It's still a tragedy. The pro-life movement should not be over. That's a huge win. That's millions more people that are alive because originalist conservative judges were appointed and were able to overturn this terrible law. And yes, it means we got to keep having the fight. We got to keep being salt and light. We got to keep being happy warriors and, to your point, having civil dialogue with people on this issue, convincing them and changing more laws. But it's not all bad, right? There are good things in the culture for conservatives, right? I think of the Second Amendment. It's never been in a better place, legally speaking, right? I know in New York, they had a law that would have been fairly restrictive about personal carry and stuff, struck down by the Supreme Court, right? And so there are wins, right? There's silver linings on the dark clouds. And so I would like to see at least some of the despair among conservatives tempered a little. The death of the Constitution has been called prematurely.
Speaking of which, though, which is why I switched back to this quote, why is it, though, that the Constitution is wholly inadequate to the government of any other? Like, if the nation is indeed declining morally and religiously, why is it that the Constitution then can't be, what's the word I'm looking for, is inadequate?
Let me think of a practical example. Let's take the Second Amendment that I mentioned. But
Hmm.
I believe in the Second Amendment. I think the Second Amendment's a good thing. But if a critical mass of your population, right, or God forbid, you get to a majority of your population are just unhinged reprobates, right, who have no love for their fellow man, well, we can see how the Second Amendment could go wrong, right? Or take the First Amendment, take freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of speech. I will say there have been some people in modern years who have tried to lump, say, like pornography in with freedom of speech. Sorry, if you couldn't do it right in the public park, right, and you'd get in trouble during the public park, it's not speech; it's something else. But as far as like the utterance of ideas, right, political ideas, religious ideas, I'm for free speech, right? But here's the thing. If you have a critical mass or, God forbid, a majority of your population, again, that's unhinged reprobates, right? Well, how are they going to use free speech, right? They're going to be out there, shouting, fighting words and, calling people slurs and all these things, which these various things I don't think should be illegal. I do think that speech should be protected. But if you had a society like the one in this quote, it wouldn't be a problem because people aren't going to want to do it. Most decent people have no desire. All decent people have no desire to like call black people the N word, right? All decent
Hmm.
no decent people don't want to like run around like cussing and swearing in front of little kids, right? Decent people want to limit those things, but when you start losing that, when you start losing that respect, and now, of course, I forget the exact reference, but you're a pastor, you'll know the verse in one of the Timothys where it talks about in the last days how people will be, men will be lovers of themselves, not lovers of God, right? All like deceitful, unholy, ungrateful, disobedient to parents, all those things. Well, as society gets more and more like that, you're going to see that the holds and the checks in the Constitution, I mean, they're not going to hold. But here's the thing: when that happens, there's going to be a call for like authoritarianism. There's going to be a call for repressive government. But that's not going to fix it either, because here's the dirty secret: repressive governments, they also can't change an immoral and irreligious people into a moral and religious people. Only freely chosen religion, freely chosen faith in God can actually produce the type of characters that we're looking for. And so when we lose it, we'll get authoritarianism, but we won't get the morality.
And that's a good point, and that's what I'm afraid of. And that's why this guy, the video we're listening, and we'll play it here, is that I think for the most part he addresses what's taking place. Obviously, we don't agree that the Constitution is dead, but what he wants to replace it with and where he wants to go, you cannot legislate morality. You cannot legislate religion. And when you try to do any of that, you're going to open up a uglier beast. Go ahead, Joey. You're chomping at the bit.
So I have to push back, but not I know because I know your view. I know we agree, but your wording is a bugaboo for mine. When you say we can't legislate morality, so we can't legislate religion. That's the better part.
Yes, you know that, knucklehead. What I mean.
Law, but here the only reason.
Yeah, that's you, the audience. Yeah.
That's what people no. This is one of those things that sometimes people will say. They'll say you can't legislate morality, but really every law is about is
yes, exactly. I mean, laws of not murder, abortion, all that is moral. What I mean, obviously, you know what I mean by that.
Even a traffic law, right? It's ultimately it's about preserving human life, which is rooted in morality. And this is where the principle that we've talked about before is so important. The government has just range of action in the second tablet of the Constitution of the the second tablet of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, right? The parts of the Ten Commandments that have to do with man's relationship with man. Government can act there. It's not tyrannical. It's not unjust. That's its job. But when it starts legislating, and this is to your point, when it starts legislating in the first four, now it's taking on a prerogative of God, which is actually blasphemous, and that's blasphemous government.
You know, and obviously, thank you for the correction, actually, because for the audience, in between you and I, we know what we're talking, we agree on what we're talking about. The thing is that we see in society today with and I guess maybe, well, we'll play the video, maybe we should get to that paper, is that the French Revolution is really that spirit that led to the debauchery of the French Revolution and the anarchy that it produced, we're starting to see here in the United States. And it seems to happen right around election seasons, right? The peaceful protests of the Black Lives Matter movement, quote unquote, right? The anarchy of these pro-Palestine people, where there is no purpose. It only seems like they're wanting to cause chaos and cause, what's the word I'm looking for? Angst amongst those of us who are moral and religious, those of us who want the nation to thrive and survive. And it's that same spirit which was different than our own revolution. And I think that's what this man in the video, Wade Stotts, is decrying. And you and I think the fork in the road for us is that I think the solutions he wants and the solutions we would want are definitely at odds. Let me keep playing the video for a bit.
To the government of any other. And as Aaron McIntyre has pointed out many times, we are no longer moral or religious. So let's do some logic here. And if you're not familiar,
that's a kind of a pattern of syllogistic.
So premise 1, the Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Premise 2, America is not a moral or religious people. And conclusion, the Constitution is inadequate to the government of America. That's what you logic heads out there might call a valid argument, the kind you can't deny without denying one of the premises.
Good God, isn't that something?
But it's not like...
Yeah, but who gets to decide? At what level? Yes, I see the rise of immorality. Obviously, polls talk about the decline of church attendance, and and obviously, religion is not what it used to be. We have too many charlatan pastors. And look, and I keep threatening to do this, but we need to finally do the episode where I blame most of the decline in morality on Christianity. Really. These false pastors who say one thing, live something else, you can only see that so much when you begin to, as a church member, begin to say, well, look, if these leaders don't believe it, why should I? And then go live a life contrary, which is why we shouldn't put our focus on religious leaders. We should put our focus on Christ. But nevertheless, the Bible does warn us that us teachers, religious teachers, are going to be judged more harshly because we do have a pulpit, no pun intended, in the public sphere that we are going to be held accountable to.
Yeah, no, I agree. But what I would say, and what I would say to Wade's point, is first of all, yes, I think it's undeniable that morality is declining in America. Now, I would also say that as far as industrialized countries go, America actually has the most religious population of like
Hmm.
the industrialized world. So
Yeah,
it's not as bad, right? I mean, it's bad. It's bad. Like the
it's
trends aren't good,
worse. It's
but
yeah, it's worse than it
there's
used to
hope.
be.
And then the other thing I would say, and again, I don't know obviously Wade stats personally, so I'm not saying anything about him, but about many people who make these arguments who are already, like, well, the country's this was like, okay, but what I want to know is what percentage of these people have a local church that they're members of, that they attend regularly, that they invest in, that they're reaching out to their neighbors to share the gospel, right? That they're, going to the local pregnancy or to their local Planned Parenthood and offering prayer outside of it? How many of them are actually engaged in evangelism, even if it's something as simple as handing a
Hmm.
gospel tract to someone, right? These little things, right? Like practically in your local area, right? If you're worried about the decline of religiosity and morality in America, well, you got to put your money where your mouth is. You got to put your action where your mouth is, and like actually start doing something, right? Because we're the like obviously the work is ultimately done by God and His Holy Spirit, but He has chosen us as vessels to do it. So if there's going to be revival in America, right, it's going to be because there's revival among the people. It's not going to come from a new form of government, but it's going to come
Hmm.
within our form of government from the people exercising the freedoms that they have in the Constitution for good, right? So, like, yes, you have the freedom of speech, and you have that free like, and this is another point. It's like, what do we have freedom for? Well, I tend to be of the mindset that yes, freedom in and of itself is a good thing, because ultimately love is the basis of God's government, right? And
Hmm.
we'll do a longer episode on the great controversy, but just basically, right, there's a spiritual war, right? In other words, Democrats aren't our real enemy, right? Or if you're a Democrat, Republicans aren't a real enemy, right? Those, like, Democrats, Republicans, they're just people. But the Bible says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the rulers of I'm terrible at quoting things.
Yeah.
But there is a spiritual warfare, right? And so, in other words, we actually have to, when we realize that, right, that also changes things, right? And so then we understand that the basis of this warfare is all over the character of God, right? And it's all over this idea of love, right? And love requires freedom. And so that's why I believe theologically that freedom is a good in and of itself, but also what society needs and why freedom exists is so that we're free to do good. We're free
Hmm.
to tell, like, if we have free speech, we can abuse free speech, and that may be our right. But what we ought to do is use that freedom to proclaim the gospel, to tell the truth, right? To proclaim good things, right? To say good things, to correct error. And so if enough people do that, right, the society can still function. And so what I would say is, like, listen, you're right, Wade. There's problem in America. So let's team up as brothers in Christ and let's reach people, let's reach souls with the gospel. And then, the Constitution will be fine, right? We'll save it for another generation.
Let's keep going.
Only the
for a
unwritten
little bit
Constitution
more.
changed. The written one has too. But that leads us to the next question. What was our Constitution? Now, the American Constitution has a reputation. It's known for certain key themes, many of which might fall under the heading of limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was designed so that power wouldn't become too concentrated. That way, the government would never do anything crazy, like kidnap your kids and give them sex changes. So the next question is, what happened? Aaron McIntyre's book, The Total State, does an excellent job answering this question. Buy it, buy it, buy it. But today, I want to look at a complimentary answer from Curtis Yarvin, seen here modeling the official Gen Xer Halloween costume. In his essay, The Iron Polygon, Yarvin says that our country has gone through at least a handful of different republics, different forms of government, each building on the one before, and each in their own way destroying the foundations of the old order. First, there was the Congressional Republic, the Republic of the Articles of Confederation. It wasn't around long, but we loved it while it lasted, sort of like Twin Peaks or the McHot Dog. People say that the only thing wrong with this period was that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, but I think the worst part is that they were still more than 200 years away from this all-American treat. Yes, the meat is the same color as the bun, but that's because we don't judge by color here. Next, there was the Constitutional Republic. This is the one people think they still live in. But the truth is that most people, even many who call themselves conservatives, would be horrified to live in this time. In this era, American states had Christian blasphemy laws, Sabbath laws, state-level Christian establishments, and in some cases, religious tests for office. Things that if you advocated for today, people would call you names and kick you out of their conferences. What most people mean when they say they want to return to constitutionalism is to return to either the 1950s or the 1990s. But if they were transported back to the actual constitutional order, they'd be horrified to see neither sock hops nor crop tops, mostly just tobacco crops and blacksmith shops. And the legal constitutional order ended about 150 years ago with the Third Republic, what Yarvin calls the Unionist Republic of the post-Civil War period. This republic, Yarvin says, abolished federalism. See, originally the states created the federal government to serve them. Now it was the other way around. There's a lot we could say about the Civil War, but as Basil Gildersleeve said, it was a point of grammatical concord which was at the bottom of the Civil War. United States are, said one, United States is, said another.
I think, and hear me out here, because I don't know if I thought this through myself as well. But one of the, I think, mistakes he's making is that the Constitution is in principle, it's a living thing, right? It gives us principles, right, to live by. But we have to, what's the word I'm looking for? As a nation grows, we have to find ways to take the principles in the Constitution and apply them while still being faithful to the Constitution. Knowledge is ever increasing. So a culture of when the Constitution was first given that is agricultural with no, well, I mean, it's totally different from today, right? With e-commerce, why am I mispronouncing that word? Right? With internet and TV and phones and things like that. The principles of the Constitution are still there. Just because man messes them up doesn't mean you do away with the paper. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I agree that we have to live out the principles of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had a slight twitch, right, and a slight tremor when you said a living Constitution, because so the doctrine of a living Constitution was this idea that was developed by my arch nemesis in history, the worst president of the United States, the worst politician to ever exist in this country, Woodrow Wilson, right, at the turn of the 1800s. And he had this idea of and what he meant by a living Constitution is, listen, right, it's all vibes and,
No,
right,
yes, that's not what I mean by it.
No, like and this is what what originalism as a legal movement is. It's the idea is we need to understand, in order to understand what the law is, we need to know what those who wrote it meant, right? And listen, it's living, I guess you could say it's living in the sense that within the Constitution, there are ways to amend it, right? And that's a constitutional process. That's legal. And that's fine. It's been amended. 20, what are we up to now? 28, 20, I don't exactly remember that. Somebody's going to shoot me. But, it's a limited number of times that it's been amended. And that's fine. And it's a high bar for amending it. But no, that like what I disagree with about what Wade is going into now is this idea of breaking America up into these three different republics. Like, no, what I think it is, we have to same Constitution. I mean, he's right. I guess you could say he's right in that there's two in a way, because the Articles of Confederation really were a different Constitution. And I think that I think Washington and the Federalists were right that ultimately it yes, you want government to be limited, but you also have to have a government that's capable of sustaining itself, right?
Hmm.
And the Articles of Confederation, it wasn't. And so we needed the Constitution. But since we've adopted the Constitution, we are still living under that same Constitution, right? Now
Hmm.
that Constitution changed. One of the biggest changes, right? One of the things that he mentioned there, right? He said, well, people want to go back to the constitutional order. But what they don't understand is that that's actually, he mentioned Sabbath laws, he mentioned blasphemy laws, he mentioned these things.
Hmm.
What he's actually getting to is that at the beginning of the Republic, it's true that the Bill of Rights of the Constitution were seen as checks against the federal government and not the state government, right? And so yes, in the Bill of Rights, you have free speech, right? You have all these things. You have the Second Amendment. You have all these things that the federal government can't attack you on, right? Can't make laws against. But for a good portion of America's history, state governments could. They could have establishments of religion. They could do, have different restrictions on speech that the federal government couldn't have. And when that changed, was the Civil War amendments, right? In other words, because there were states in the South, they denied just blatantly rights to, they weren't considered citizens at the time, but to black people, right, to their slaves, and then after they were emancipated, to black Americans. And so the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, these are the Civil War amendments. I think it was the 14th Amendment, is called the Incorporation Doctrine, which basically incorporated the rights in the Bill of Rights to the states. And so, yes, so now, since then, when the Constitution says you have freedom of religion, that means you are now protected freedom of religion from both the federal government and the state
And the
government, right?
state.
Because these rights that were enshrined on a federal level were then enshrined on the state level. I tend to think that's a good thing, right? But that's not a new constitution. It's the
No, yeah,
constitution was
exactly. And that's what I mean by living constitution is that following its internal checks and balances, you can amend the Constitution. And I looked it up real quick. We have 27 now, or when we first started with the 10 Bill of Rights. What happened?
I was one off.
Oh, yeah. And so, yeah, you're probably thinking about the 28 fundamental beliefs. Well, anyway, and so that's what I mean by it is that the document to me is so brilliant that it gives the people the power to to amend it in order to better understand the rock solid principles it's advocating, which is obviously at its core, it's freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? It's that core that man is free and created, right, by God with inalienable rights. And so that's what I love about it. And so for him to break it down in three segments as if each segment is betraying the whole, it's not, because if each segment was betraying the whole, then there would have, first of all, this we wouldn't have lasted this long, and second of all, there'd be challenges to it. But both sides, for the most part, up till now, are happy with the amendments we have. The interpretations, we may differ on them, but no one is actually proposing yet to do away with any of the amendments or to do away with the Constitution. Unfortunately, yet. Unfortunately, these type of individuals are actually undermining themselves because they're planting the seed and trying to raise the movement to undermine that which they think is already happening. You were smiling there. What's your thought?
Yeah, well, I do actually want to. I believe it's the let me see, right here. So I totally agree with what you said, except for one thing. There is a
Hmm.
guy, there's at least one guy who wants to repeal one of the amendments, like the 17th Amendment. I'd love to repeal it, right? Which called for the direct election of senators. But that's a whole nother
Okay,
conversation.
yeah. Yeah, but I think that's even within though what I'm talking about,
Yes.
right? It's within the right that if we go through the process, we can do so if we wanted to. But it's still within the process of what the Constitution is standing for. What this guy Stott is advocating is doing away with it kind of because he thinks it's dead and coming up with something new. Well, I don't trust your something new. I want to reform. I want to bring people back by persuasion, by the power of God, by the Spirit, to become the people who can live together. We don't have to be the same, we can be different, but can live peacefully together as our nation is called, the United States, not this division that we see. Look, we only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to jump to this article. Tell the people about this article.
Yeah, so this was the article. But it's by Irving Kristol. Highly recommend it. And he was basically talking about what made the American Revolution different, right? In other words, because the American Revolution was kind of seen as it was kind of the first, like America is in many ways the first modern democracy. And there's been many other revolutions that have happened since that age,
Hmm.
but they haven't all, most, virtually none of them have worked out the same way with the same success that the American Revolution did. And so what he was breaking down is why the American Revolution was different.
Yeah, and look, I highly recommend this paper to people. You have to read it. What fascinates me, and this has nothing to do with the paper, is that the warnings he's writing about were written 51 years ago. Which, how do I know they were written 51 years ago? Well, right there it says 1973, but that year is the year I was born. I'm actually older than this paper. I was born in March 1973. But the concerns he has in this paper, I think this man is probably rolling in his grave now if he would see society today, right? If he would see society today with what he was warning us with back then, I think the man would have a heart attack and die again because this writing actually is, to me, it's almost like prophetic. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. One of the key things that I took away, right, when he was comparing the difference like between the French Revolution, the American Revolution, in other words, the American Revolution in a lot of ways, right? In other words, revolutionaries generally and naturally, they know what they're against, right? But it's knowing what you're for, right? It's knowing that what comes the day after the revolution,
Hmm.
right? That's hard, right? And most revolutionaries who are passionate and brash, right? They don't have that thought out. And in many ways, the American Revolution did, right? And he brought out the point how the revolutionary era literature, right? The sermons, the pamphlets, they were actually all measured, right? They had this kind of thought out political philosophy in a way that you don't see, right? In other words, in France, you'll see is
Hmm.
like the king is bad, right? The church is bad, right? And so, let's get a head on a plate, right? But what happens next is like, well, I don't know. And
Hmm.
so I just for me, like that was the key thing is like, and that's again why when I see this push and why I would urge everyone read this article, right? Read and get back in touch with that founding generation, and you'll understand why the thing that we have here, this American experiment, it's fragile, but it is worth protecting with our lives because I am not confident. I don't know about you guys watching, but I'm not confident in the caliber of American society now to have a plan B to the founders system.
Let me read this quote from the book of the article. It says, all revolutions unleash tides of passion, and the American Revolution was no exception. But it was exceptional in the degree to which it was able to subordinate these passions to serious and nuanced thinking about fundamental problems of political philosophy. And I love that because when you think of the people now, today, protesting for Gaza, right? For the Palestine people, for the Palestine government. And when you hear stuff like queers for Palestine, they have, I 100% they haven't thought that through. Because if they would just go there and try to align themselves with the Palestine people in their current state, they'd be dead in 5 minutes. They would be crushed in an instant. And so they haven't thought it through. Plus, there's a video I saw, and I'll get to it here. Well, I mean, I don't have the video, but there was a video I saw that there was a queer man dressed completely in drag talking to a woman about who does she support, Israel or Palestine. And she said Palestine all the way proud. And then he explained to her that a person like himself would be dead in 5 minutes. And this lady who was protesting there on the street didn't even know that would be the case. She thought that would be the case in Israel, not in Palestine. She had it completely reversed. These people are fighting for that which they know not. And that's what differentiated the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution was just pure anarchy and passion. Let's blow it all up and start new. And when they did, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to start. Whereas the American Revolution, as the paper says, was thought out. They knew the human passion is fickle. They knew that the greed for money, the greed for power is inborn in us. And so they made a government in which there was checks and balances where these men who were popular, right? George Washington, Madison, Hamilton, John Jay, all these guys, they could have probably persuaded people to make them king. And matter of fact, you pointed out in a previous episode that they wanted to make George Washington king. But these men were so principled that they understood it needed to be a government of we the people. And yet these anarchies, these Black Lives Matter riots, we see in principle what happens when you have anarchy and not a thought out revolution. Because all these Black Lives Matter leaders, all they did was line their pockets with mansions and fancy cars at the expense of what? The people they riled up to give them money. Whereas the Republic and those people who wrote our Constitution, who were in that, Congress to first start the Constitution, these men were looking for the greater good. As frail as they were men of morals and religion. And that's what we're missing today. Excuse the rant.
Oh, good. Rant on. No, that's totally agree. That's totally good. And to that point, one of the guys that what's his name mentioned, Wade mentioned, Curtis Yarvin, right? He's one of those dissident right thinkers for people to keep an eye on. But that's what he wants. He wants a kind of corporate monarchy, right? He wants a
Mm-hmm.
centralized executive to just make the decisions. And here's the thing, like so I've read a bit of Yarvin, and he's obviously a very smart guy. He's one of those guys who I think he's a little bit too smart for his own good. Like he thinks he's looking at the stats, he's looking at this, he's looking at that, he's looking at the problems in our system. But what the part that's missed is we've tried monarchy before. Like monarchy is nothing
Yeah.
new. Like centralizing power in a strong man, that's nothing new, right? That's an old way. That's not part of, and this I'll harken this back to Wade's first point, where you're talking about the fact that the Constitution requires a culture supporting it. Well, this it's also true that you have to look at the culture, a form of government that's totally out of line with the culture and the character of the people that have been formed by that culture. That's also not going to work. And here's the thing: Americans, they do actually like their freedom. They like their like the back to Max Weber's point, Americans like questioning authority. And so if you try to just assert this totally new system with a centralized, guy who gets to call all the shots, right, from a right wing point of view, that's not going to go over well either, right? That's not going to produce what you want. And again, it's all jumping around the main point, right? And the main problem. The main problem is people's hearts. And when people's hearts aren't submitted to Christ, right? When people's hearts don't recognize the natural law, then any system that they're in, they're gonna push against the rails, right? And so the core is what we ought to be praying for and working for in our communities is revival, right? And that's by persuasion, that's by convincing people, right? And then in upholding the principles of the system for all these people that are despairing, have you run for office, right? Have you run for Congress? Have you run for state legislator? Have you run for your local school board, right? You're tired of drag queen story hour in your local school? Run for the school board. Do something about it in your local community. Before we all say the sky's falling, the system's dead, actually work within the system, right? Like something like less than 10% of the American population votes in primaries, right? Well, you don't like the fact that you got two very old lackluster candidates. Well, that's on you, people. 90% of you, right, didn't vote in the primaries, right? So you had no hand in selecting the candidates. So I think let's not call the system dead. Let's advocate people to actually work within the system to change things.
I would love to see a 35-year-old president, conservative president, because that's as young you can be to be president. I would love to see that in my lifetime, see how that would turn out. Look, before we wrap up, there's some tweets you want us to look at. Give me the background to this tweet. I'll read it here for us. It says, Liberalism is subject to entropy and corruption, like anything else, and that's not unique to liberalism. I would challenge you to show me another system that isn't subject to decay and corruption over time. Everything must be periodically refreshed and restored. What's the context of this? Obviously, you gave them to me to show.
If you click on the one
Go
that he
ahead.
quote tweeted, you can see what he's responding to.
Okay, it says, if the argument is that liberalism
Oh, scroll,
has been,
scroll up. The
oh,
one right
okay.
above. There we go. So Josh Dawes, they
Mm-hmm.
were talking about how I'm trying to remember the context here. Oh, this idea of like woke right and these right wingers that are, again, I think this would include like Wade Stotts, who are for, there's this movement called like post liberalism. And here when like Joel said liberalism, lowercase l, right? This is classical liberalism. This is like John Locke,
Mm-hmm.
and like the American
Yeah.
tradition broadly. And he's not speaking of leftism, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Joel's a,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
but the point is, and then Joel went on to say in that in a thread, he's like, listen, because then they were pointing to why we need a new system, a new philosophy because of all the bad things that are happening, and he pointed right, and I think Joel made the point right that anti-liberalism in the 20th century killed far more people than wokeism or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And then Josh Dawes said, he made a valid point. He's like, listen, the numbers of child sacrifice, it pales even to right, those that were beheaded and burned at the stake in Christendom. And Joel pointed out, he's like, listen, abortion is anti-liberal. In other words, what he means by that is, listen, liberalism is all about the rights of the individual. Well,
Mm-hmm.
when you actually understand that the unborn is a human being, well, then you understand what Joel's saying. And then that led to his
Mm-hmm.
that you started with, right? That liberalism is subject
Hmm.
to entropy, right? And so the natural state of it, it's going to fall. And so then people say, well, liberalism's falling, so we need to throw it out. But rather than, no, let this system, like any other system, is subject to entropy. So let's renew it. Let's have civic virtue and let's restore those things. Let's fight for it rather than just give up on it. And it's the same
Yeah.
sort of thing we've been talking about this
Here's,
idea.
I guess, another tweet you brought and kind of could be addressing this. It says, blaming classical liberalism for failing to preserve liberty seems to me like blaming a plant for growing wild when you fail to prune it, or blaming it for dying when you fail to water it. It's true. You don't maintain your car, don't expect it to run as well as it could have had you kept up with the maintenance, right? If you don't take care of your body, don't expect it to live as long as somebody who does. And so it's the same thing. And look, this may not be a good analogy, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. You know, we agree that love requires freedom, and freedom makes evil possible. Not that it has to. Evil doesn't have to happen because that's the choice of the individual. But we saw that in heaven, right? God is love. Ultimate love requires freedom. And freedom gave rise to the possibility of evil, which Satan took. And so people have to understand that in order for us to live truly free lives, there's going to be disagreements. There's always going to be a tension. But we can't abandon the desire for true freedom because of certain bad apples or a certain bad, time in our history. We don't give up on it. That's not the American spirit. That's not the spirit of actual true freedom and liberty. We got to fight for that which we believe, even if we may be, quote unquote, up against the ropes at the moment.
Yeah. As we're looking to wrap up, I guess
Hmm.
the biggest thing that I would point out, and I think it's one of the biggest mistakes that people make, is people assume liberalism, and now again talking about classical liberalism, Lockean liberalism, that
Hmm.
that this is simply just a product of the Enlightenment, and this is anti-Christianity, right? This is pro-secular, and
Hmm.
what I would say is like I think that's actually a misread of how we got liberalism. First of all, John Locke, right, was a Protestant minister, I
Hmm.
believe, but he was very much a Christian. He wrote all about natural law, from a Protestant perspective, right? And his theory of natural rights were incorporated with his theory of natural duties and responsibilities. And so rather than seeing liberalism, right, as the antithesis of Christianity, right, what I think is more accurate is it's the product of the development of Christianity. Tom Holland's book Dominion really does this. But in other words, no other society besides the West, right, the Christian West, developed a system where men were as free as they have been in the United States of America and in the West more broadly, right? And so when we actually view liberalism rightly as this product of the Protestant Reformation and of Christianity, then we see, okay, what Joel's saying, right? That in order to have this system where men are free, which is how I essentially see liberalism, in order for it to work, we have to have the Christianity part, right? We can't lose the
Well,
roots.
well, yeah.
That
Well,
doesn't
let
mean
me get to his. Let me get to his tweet.
yeah.
Right. I think a better way to say this, he says, although not as provocative or clickbaity, nothing against clickbait, would be you can't have freedom without Christianity, which is 100% true. That said, we should want freedom for everyone, just as we want Christianity for everyone, and it's worth fighting and hoping for. Do you agree with his statement? Is the question, the natural question that arises.
So I agree with the point he's making. In other words, at a certain point, and I actually believe that the point he's making is ultimately John Adams' point, right?
Hmm.
Um, is now I think it's also true. There's this thing called inertia, right? And so the way I look at it is Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity, built the tree of classical liberalism, right? And if the roots are sick, the tree stays upright for a while, right?
Hmm.
Or to use a car analogy, a car can run on fumes for a bit, right? So you can have that in a sense, a Richard Dawkins is a Christian. As he said, he's like, I'm a cultural Christian. You can
Hmm.
have that, and you can have the good things of Christianity or the good things of liberalism for a while, but eventually, if the roots don't get watered, if they don't get fertilized and they die all the way, well, eventually you're going to see the leaves start dying, and then the tree is going to start dying. It's going to hollow out, and then the tree's dead. It's not going to produce fruit. And so, what I would say to Joel's point, and I think Joel has been a really good voice, is that's what the role of a Christian ought to be. And this comes back to, what do we have freedom for? Right? Why, like, in other words, we have a free church, right? The church is not under the control of the state, nor should it be. And so what do we do with that freedom? Right? Do we just take it for granted? Technically, that could be our right. Wait, we could just become fat and happy mega churches. Guess what? Those fat and happy churches have a right to exist. They have religious liberty to exist. But in my view, they're not adding to the fertilizer of the tree. Where the kind of churches that are using their freedom well are small, local churches that are making disciples who are becoming self-governing people. So that those are people, they don't need an overbearing Washington to control them because they're free, right? And so I would say the greatest threat to liberty is that we stop being self-governing. So let's rededicate ourselves to Christ, and let's become self-governing.
That's a great point to end on here on the Gio and Joey show. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Look, the famous quote, right? Give me liberty or give me
Death.
death, right? That's how important it is. And it was so important to our Lord and Savior that He died in order to secure us the ultimate freedom. May we not take it for granted, and may we not take it for granted that it's always going to last here. And even though Joey and I have prophetic understanding of what's going to take place in America, just because we understand that prophecy doesn't mean we're going to let it happen. We want to stay the winds of strife as long as possible so that all may have an opportunity to surrender to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Until next time on the Gio and Joey show, be blessed. Any final words, Joey?
Nope, I think you said it well.
All right, take care.